Okay. One thing that came up during break that I wanted to talk about is the reflection papers versus the research paper. So first of all, the reflection papers, I imagine them being in the range of 5 to 10 page papers. If you get shorter than 5, chances are you left something out. More than 10, you probably don't need to go there. But, okay, if you get like a 12-page paper, I do not want you to spend time making it go from 12 to 10. You know, I don't want a 22-page paper. But you got better things to do. I'd rather have you read an article or something than the time it takes. And I know from my personal experience, sometimes it's easier to write a 12-page paper than a 9-page paper. You know, and then you spend all this time editing, and you're not learning anything in that. You're just meeting an instructor's expectation. So, and I'm not critiquing my colleagues who would say absolutely 10. That forces a certain kind of thought, but it's fine. But 5 to 10 gives you some sense of what's expected. Also, the readings, for instance, that you'll be reflecting on for the first paper are all assignments in class. So there's no additional reading. The second paper, you'll have to read an article or a chapter from a book. Whatever I do with it, I may do something different. Usually I just turn you loose and say, write a paper on one of the themes of the second half of the class from the midterm on. And use those like you do, you know, the feminist or the global, or they're kind of in units. You do one of those, and I want you to find one additional reading, just to get you into the library, learn how to use some things. You get that in other classes too. But so for those 2 papers, you'd have like one article or book chapter in addition. Research paper, you need to do several books, maybe not the whole book. You know, we can talk about how you do research, but books, articles, etc. It's more work, so I don't want to have any illusions about that. And I should say, the absolutely worst thing you can do, though there's almost always somebody who does it, a smaller class, maybe not, but is you get to the night before the first reflection paper's due and you haven't really done it, and then you say, oh, I think I'll do a research paper. You will hate that in November. Because the research papers are great and really energizing if you have a topic you really want to pursue. If you just sit down and say, I'm doing this because I didn't do that stupid paper in October, you're going to hate it. And it's, you know, so really think this through. But I do want you to have the option, and you can all do research papers if you want, of pursuing a topic that you would really like to pursue. And sometimes you just don't get that chance. You haven't had a chance to do this. You want to dig into something more. And this way, at least it's satisfying a requirement. You're not just out there on your own doing it. So think about that as you go through. And then if you're going to do a research paper, sometime after midterm, we can sit down and talk, or even before, anytime you want. Sit down and talk about the topic and try to refine it. My typical approach to just about everything, writing grants, writing papers, reading papers, is have you sort of just follow your nose at the beginning. Just get a big sense of the lay of the land, and then narrow it. Because what almost always happens is you get a topic and you think, you know, there isn't much written on this. Those of you who've been here a while, I'm sure, have experienced this, but there isn't much written on this. This will be fine. You go to the library and you find out there's 1,000 items on this topic. You say, who's writing on, you know, 8th century hymnody and whatever, and boom, there it is. The function of the tenure expectation. People write all this stuff that nobody reads. Anyhow, so then you got to get a sense of all that, and then we can start narrowing it down. And what that will do, I think, the narrowing will be, it'll sharpen your sense of what the issue is you want to address. They usually start out pretty broad. That's fine. Dive in the library, swim around a while and all this stuff, come back up and say, oh, okay, now I see all the options. I want to do this. And we can make that possible. So there's virtually no, I actually take this as a kind of personal intellectual challenge. There's virtually no topic you can come up with that we can't relate to this class. So you should be able to, if you want to write on something, come talk to me. We can work that out. It seems like there's one other thing. Oh, there's some questions about the first creed. I just want to be sure that what's due next time. Don't stress about this. I want it to be serious. That's the most important thing. The idea is, what do you believe about Jesus? Doesn't need to be justified, don't need qualifications, don't need because clauses. It's one of the few things you'd write for an academic class where you don't need because. You can just assert, this is what I believe. Now, if you want to add more, that's totally up to you. It really is your document. I get the privilege of kind of peeking over your shoulder in that. So, any questions on that? Okay, other questions on the, I've kind of just deluged you. This is not typical. My style is not just to lecture all the time, but since we haven't had any readings, I thought we would take advantage of our time together with this. So, any questions? Yeah.
Follow up on this idea of the ellipse up here.
Right.
And the revelation from God being something that comes in. But then you make a statement such as, all knowledge of God is mediated
right.
through human experience. And if that's true, then so is that.
That's.
And the same thing that he was given them, the
doctrine
of the Trinity, I mean, was developed over time by humans with a lot of struggle.
Yep.
Up to a certain point, in which then it was then defined.
You define
Well,
exactly.
But human activity, we don't know what role God played in that.
Right.
But on the surface, at least, it's all human activity.
Yeah. No, I agree. And what that may mean is that we are, you could say doomed, because there's something kind of frustrating about this. We can't get behind theology. So Richard McBrien, in the second chapter, I think it is, of his book on Catholicism, and this is maybe the first edition, they might have changed this in the second edition, but he tells a story about parents coming to a religious ed teacher and saying, my kids are getting all this theology, can't you just give them the faith? And he says, well, the faith you're talking about is just the theology of a different age that gets sort of crystallized in a way. You can't get behind the theology in that the theology is always going to have, it's the mediation, it's this human experience. Now we can reflect on our experience psychologically, philosophically, and so on. But we do even that in terms of experience. That's part of what philosophers have become aware of. And in some ways, this is the big move from the Enlightenment to postmodernism, which will make sense, I hope, by the end of the lecture, beginning next time. But this awareness of what we bring to the equation. In fact, you're on TV. Hey! I don't know why it's red. It should be following me. This is red. Okay, it does. I got too far off screen. Okay, I got out of bounds. So I was thinking outside the box, right? Can I erase this? Okay. Because I want to come back to that in lots of ways. In some ways, that shapes the whole class. It shapes my whole approach to theology, that darned ellipse. Which means it's easy for it to get kind of trite. But, okay. Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. It's very relevant to this question. I'll put it in a historical context later, but we can be brief then. So if we have the knower and the thing known. This is often identified in the German, the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Okay, but the thing known. Okay. In an Aristotelian view, your mind is a blank slate. Okay? You're with me? Just blank. Plato had the idea that we're born with that mind full of ideas, but we've forgotten them, and what our experience does is remind us of things. Okay? It just has context. Aristotle switched that and said, no, we start with a blank slate, we experience things in the world, and we experience a multiplicity of things. Do you mind if I just... So these are all books, and then you start to abstract from the many to the one concept of book that they all have in common. And if you looked at just these books, you might think that all books have something to do with God, while your experience is too limited. So you get a phone book, you get a novel, you get other things. It says, oh, okay, what's a book? And okay, bookness, and you get that identified. But it all starts from experience, and it's almost like, and it kind of does talk like this, it writes images on our blank slate in the mind, like an image of a horse. And then you abstract from that horse to the idea of horse. And then that idea is what you work with intellectually. Okay? So you abstract from the particular to the concrete. But the point is, the mind is a blank slate. Kant's thinking about this. And this flows from the empiricists and the rationalists after Descartes and so on. And Kant brings them together. But he says, you know, what if the mind isn't a blank slate? What if the knower actually comes sort of pre-programmed certain ways so that, you know, well, in an Aristotle's view, it just comes in and that's it, you know, writes on that slate. But here he'd say that there's an input from the thing known, but that input comes on a slate that's already shaped. So the best image I can think of that, to illustrate that point, would be eyesight, okay? So, I mean, at some level you could say, well, glasses help me see more clearly. Well, how do I know the back of the room isn't really fuzzy and the glasses are distorting it? There's something coming to me from there. The glasses help me perceive that in a way that I say is accurate, but my glasses interact with what's coming in to create what I know. Well, if you take off the glasses, forgetting about the glasses, my eyes themselves have rods and cones in them and things that shape what I'm able to see, and we now know that there's a much wider spectrum of light than just the visible light that I can see, infrared, ultraviolet, etc. And if I put on an infrared lens, I see things very differently. Doesn't mean they're not there. They're really there, but when I look with just my eyes, I can't see them. So what I see is a function of the physiological stuff I bring to this encounter and the input. The input's important, so it's not nihilistic. There's really something out there. But I bring, so it's the interplay between these two. So the knower brings things to, we'll call it the encounter, that equals knowledge. Well, no, okay, the encounter plus the input from the ding. That equals knowledge. This is revolutionary. And part of it, Kant's whole thing, I mean, the Critique of Pure Reason is like another one of those like 800-page fine print books, only it's way harder than a biography of Bonhoeffer. But he says, okay, the thing is, of course, I can only know this by thinking about myself. I can't get out of myself to know this. So I have to deduce this from all kinds of things. And he's very careful about how you do this deduction. It's like you can't watch yourself watching yourself. You can't get out of yourself. As a knower, you always bring this. So how do you know those things that you're bringing to the encounter? How can you discern those? It's very difficult, which means it's very easy to take them for granted. Now, he says, there's this, he calls it the noumena. You notice I'm not starring these terms. You don't need to remember. It'd be nice if you did. But noumena, which is the thing in itself. That is unknowable. It's a kind of agnosticism. We know that it's there. That's all we know. Because knowledge is the product of this plus this, and that he calls the phenomenon. Now, I'm not saying we're doing theology in a Kantian way. There's a lot about Kant that needs to be, you can get beyond Kant. But this realization, where you don't need his whole system, but the realization that we bring something to this encounter characterizes the modern world. And what happens is for Kant, this is like, he talks about the Aristotle's categories are not categories in the world out there, they're categories in our thinking. So this includes things like time and space. Does the world really have time or space? He says, we don't know. That's part of the noumena. We only know it as we encounter it, and maybe we bring those categories to the encounter, and we're temporalizing and spatializing things. All right, but that's all very much in the individual. Since then, we've thought more about things like how our culture shapes us, and our culture is part of what we bring to the encounter, or our gender, or our race. And these things shape how we, notice this, how we experience the world. So still on the MA reading list for systematics is a book by one of my teachers, George Lindbeck, which argues that the usual way of thinking that dogma or words, concepts, are an interpretive overlay on some raw experience. He says, I don't know about that raw experience. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. As soon as we know about it, kind of like kicking it into this, or he does it with Wittgenstein, but kicking it into this, as soon as we know about it, we've brought things to bear. So he says, our experience of God, not just our interpretation, our experience of God is shaped by things like our liturgical context. We are formed to experience God in a Trinitarian way. Doesn't mean God isn't truly Trinitarian. But we need to be formed into that. And so the power of formation. So in that sense, there's a kind of realization that with our experience, what we bring to this, whether it's cultural, all of that, is going to shape how we answer the question, who do you say I am? It's going to shape our theology, and we can't distill that off. Now that's the controversial claim. Others would say you can. No, absolutely you can. You can get to this essence. I'm not persuaded. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be. And I think this isn't just like some powerful philosophical point. To me, this is why the incarnation is important and necessary. It strengthens our sacramental awareness to say that our knowledge of God is always mediated. You could argue that's a very Catholic point. And it's why we have this sacramental imagination, why we think the world is a good place, because God can be known here. This is how God comes to us. It's not all evil. But it does put a big weight on that experience quotient, which is precisely not authoritative. Yeah, that makes sense. That was a way long answer. I promise they won't all be that long. But there were things I wanted to say that I'd forgotten to get to. Yeah. Others. Yeah. Oh.
Lex orandi, lex credendi.
Yes, right. Say more about that for people that don't know. Lex orandi, lex credendi.
It's just the way we worship is the way we believe, and the way we believe is the way we worship.
Right. And it goes through the reciprocal relationship, right? So and we'll see this actually later in the course as we get to the New Testament, that the Christians believed, well, let me back up. Excuse me. The Christians practiced praying to Jesus. They just knew instinctively right away this was the right thing to do. So that was their lex orandi, the law of their praying. Then they had to make sense out of this. What are we doing? They never thought we shouldn't be doing it, but they didn't know what this meant. Well, you only pray to God. Well, then, is that what we're saying, really? Maybe. Let's read Isaiah again. Let's read, and it started to shape how they read and interpreted the scriptures to lead to and how they interpreted what they experienced with Jesus after the resurrection. Yeah, right, good. Others? Okay, and we'll get the kind of theological payoff of this, I hope, during the course of the term. Otherwise, this is just kind of an idle speculation. But what I hope I'm doing is creating a framework that we can exploit as we go through the course. Otherwise, when I first started doing this, I did it more piecemeal. So if something would come up, we'd talk about this. And students told me that, they're helpful as a kind of immediacy to it, but it didn't really make as much sense. So if I can give you this story is kind of a map, and then we can locate ourselves on that as we go forward. Okay. Oh, I realized that I didn't have my email on the syllabus, so that's it. The online students have it, but in case you want to send me anything or anything at all. Okay. Yeah, good enough. No. So, you might say, is Christological, and then you have the divine and the human. And how do they relate? And I alluded to that earlier in terms of the importance of this in shaping the identity and difference, and that the presence of God does not eliminate our humanity. But throughout Christian history, there have been times for all of us, all the denominations, some denominations more than others perhaps, where they really fought this unity of the two and seemed to act as if the presence of the human is a threat to the divine. When you think of how some people want to read Scripture, that they're afraid to see that, so this book is the Word of God and the Word of humans. It's both. And the only access we have to the Word of God is through the words of humans. Someone would say, no, we want to get rid of that humanity. This is an inspired book. And what some of them mean by the inspiration is a kind of what's called a mechanical dictation theory of inspiration, where the writer, the human writer, so nobody denies that there's human writers. They all know that. But what is that human, how influential is the human part? Well, it's like, so I'm in some kind of state where I'm inspired, and God just uses me like I want to use this chalk. So think of this chalk as the person, and I guess that means I'm God. But I'm writing with this, and I want to write Bill, or you can just say that, and it just goes with the flow. Or I want to write Bill, but the chalk wants to write Jane, and we get kind of it's a messy thing. Well, the mechanical dictation theory basically eliminates any human input. And we as humans are as passive and inconsequential as this chalk is to my writing on the board. Well, once we bring in human will and we start bringing in things like culture and all that stuff, it gets really messy. But that's, again, how we get this, the Word of God and Word of humans. Oops. But you could see that, so Catholics, we can feel a little superior about this because fundamentalism has never really been a big defining part of Catholic experience, for the most part. But where we have this is more on either doctrine or the theology of the church, where we did not want to see that history played a significant part in the evolving theology of the church. So for a long time, up until the 19th century, our history was kind of a projection backwards of what we now knew. Because we knew that the church hadn't changed, because change is a sign of corruption. Therefore, the church, whatever the church was now, had to be back in the past. So Peter was like the imperial papacy of the Renaissance. Really? Well, if you actually read the text, none of them look like that. And that doesn't mean that the papacy we have today is wrong. It's just a product of evolution, development. But no, that just wasn't how we saw history, because things were unchanging. That change is a sign of this human corruption. God doesn't change, therefore the church never changed. Well, that's our way of rejecting the human influence on the church. And as we started to see that, especially after Vatican II when it got more popular, this is, in some ways, this is my experience of Vatican II. So we start out, before that we know that everybody who's changed is wrong, right? And we haven't changed. We could say that because we didn't talk to many Orthodox people. But anyhow, we hadn't changed, therefore we were right. The bishops go to Rome, come back, and we change the liturgy. How can this be anything but wrong? I think the basic trauma of the council, pastorally, and for many folks, was not this or that change, but the phenomenon of change itself. Change was now okay. Wow, now that's a huge change in orientation to the world. And we'll set that up some more later. But we do this in terms of the doctrine of the church. We want to see it only as the work of the Holy Spirit. And if humans are involved, they're kind of mechanical dictation type. So we have our own challenges there. How we understand spirituality and so on, all of that, again, is related to this interplay of the two. Okay. Moving on to the Enlightenment. I don't mean like our personal enlightenment, but this phenomenon of the Enlightenment, which is in many ways equal to modernity. So when when people talk about the postmodern, what they really mean is post-enlightenment. There's a question whether postmodern is really post-enlightenment or is it actually ultra-enlightenment, but we don't need to get into that, thankfully. It's ultra, but that's another matter. Okay, enlightenment. Essentially, at its high point, the 18th century, for reasons I'll make clear in a moment, you can think of the United States as a creation of the Enlightenment. So if you think the United States begins in 1776, it gives you an orientation when the Enlightenment was happening. It was just a hook to hang these things on. But the roots of the Enlightenment go way further back. Can I catch this? There we go. The roots of the Enlightenment go further back to, you could say, the scientific revolution. And we can date that to Isaac Newton. Well, wait a minute. Let's go behind Newton. Newton's the high point, but we can go to Copernicus. What did Copernicus do? Heliocentric. Very good. So the sun is at the center rather than the earth at the center, which is odd because right away, so we're tracing the roots of the Enlightenment, which celebrate in many ways humanity, to a person who displaces humans from the center of the universe. Prior to that, prior to Copernicus, and we can think of this, the earth is at the center, then we have spheres with the moon, and then planets, and stars. And then beyond here, someplace is God, okay? And so and this is the Aristotelian universe, Ptolemaic, et cetera. There's one law of physics for sublunary world and another law for the world up there. For instance, this motion is perpetual. They just keep moving. It doesn't occur here. I mean, because the stars don't fall down. I mean, it's very prima facie. And what is more empirically true than that I stand here and I watch the sun move from the east to the west? So don't tell me about things. This is clear. What do you mean? Here I can watch. So if you're truly an empiricist, that's it. Well, what you need to learn is that what you see is not necessarily what's true, which is a big lesson to learn. And standing on this earth, of course, are humans. Look better than that, but humans. And so we are at the center of the universe. We are the focus of God's attention. Copernicus comes along and says, no, you've got the sun, and then you have other planets, and then the stars out here. Now, Thomas Kuhn, a great book. There's no particular reason for you to read it for this class, but The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Paradigm changing, but he focuses a lot on this. I read that book first with, some of you will appreciate this, with Father Wilfred when he taught history of science when I was an undergrad here, which goes way back. But it's still fabulous. And what Kuhn argues is that we tend to think, and this is very much relevant to the Enlightenment, tend to think that knowledge moves in certain, especially scientific knowledge, just progresses and builds on more data, and we change things because we get new data and we add to that. He says that is never how scientific revolution and real change happens. Real change happens not because you have new data, but because you put the old data in a new picture, and everything looks different. And in fact, he says, and he uses this as a classic case, so this is Copernicus. At the time of the change from the from the Earth-centered, geocentric world to the heliocentric world, these people had more data and better predictions. But what they had done, so like the movement of Mars, for instance, apparently it moves along, and then if you track it every night, and it's very accurate data here, it goes backwards against certain of the stars. So how do you explain this movement backwards? Well, you have a little circle inside the circle, and everything moves by circles. So then for a while it looks like it's going backwards. And if you get that calculated right, you can predict very precisely where Mars is going to be at any particular time. And then you get epicycles within epicycles. And so at the end, the biggest argument for this was that this world is more beautiful, more elegant, and simpler. This just got so incredibly complex. They decided they can't work that way. Then after, so, and Kuhn calls this a paradigm change. We're not changing the data. And that there are, what happens is there are anomalies that arise, things that the scientists can't explain. At some point, initially they just say, well, we'll figure it out later. But at some point, these anomalies, these things that just don't fit the law, nomos, pile up, and then they are prone, they're open to accepting a different paradigm, a different picture. So the big thing is the picture. Once they made this shift, then the new paradigm suggests new, let's say, places to look for data, or in the language we've been using, let's say, experience. Once you shift your picture, and you say, oh, well, maybe there's going to be another planet out here. That may be why this moves. They turn their telescopes there, and sure enough, there's a planet. Einstein changes the whole theory of relativity in light, and they say, well, this might mean that light bends. Let's look at this, and sure enough, they did experiments, and they found that it did. Okay, so, but that only happens because they have this new model. Well, so Copernicus, that's very revolutionary, okay? It changes our way of thinking, and the church's resistance to this linked the church to the old ways. The old ways are medieval, and they want to be not medieval. We'll say in a moment what that means. But very conscious, for one of the first times in history, of we are not like the people in the past. And part of what that means is a belief in progress. Because we have these scientific changes, and we're getting better, we have progress. And I think so in the Middle Ages, still reeling from the fall of Rome in 410 and later, to me, the experience of this is, how many of you have been in the Pantheon in Rome? Okay, it's great. There's this hole in the center, right? It's a dome with a hole in the center. In the Middle Ages, nobody knew how to make this. So the experience would be, you walk into this space and you look around and you say, there were once people like me who walked the earth who could build this. We can't. We'll be lucky to preserve what we inherited. So the whole mentality is about preserving the fragments of the past that we have, because the past was the golden age, not the future, the past. And we need to get back to that. We need to remember, we need tradition, all of that, all of which is very good. But in that context, once we switch to say, now you walk in there and let's say you're from Dallas and I've never been to the stadium, but they've got a big hole in the middle and say, oh, we got a place like this back in Texas. It's about 5 times as big and a way bigger hole in the middle. This was a good start. We perfected it. Yeah, okay, caricature. But the same idea of, our sense of the past is, yeah, they did fine, we do better. And next year is going to be better than this. So that whole orientation to progress, which characterizes the modern, comes out of here. And that means leaving the Middle Ages behind. Well, Copernicus gets followed by Galileo and Kepler, and then Isaac Newton. And what Newton does that's really big, that had not actually been done before, and it's, so Newton dies in 1727, Copernicus in 1543, so 200 years. Newton comes up with a physics that's able to say the laws on the planets and the laws on Earth are the same. And the laws of motion apply to everything, stars to pieces of chalk. This is like, again, revolutionary. I mean, the stars are no different than we are. No. Okay. In a way, it's like Genesis 1. Stars they're rocks. They're stuff that God made. Our neighbors worship these things. I'm telling you, it's a rock. This is pretty revolutionary there as well. But then this leads to Descartes. Identified as the father of modern philosophy. He dies in 1650. Extremely significant for us. In some ways, you could say what he does put humanity back at the center of the universe. So it took 200 years to figure out how to do that, and Descartes did. So let me show what he does. He says, well, for one thing, Descartes, and this is a great irony, I think, in an age that prides itself on being scientific and empirical, the father of modern philosophy is an idealist, not empiricist. That is to say, as an idealist, he believes that ultimate reality is an idea, and that we derive stuff from that, not the other way around. So he's in the tradition of Plato, not of Aristotle. You know, and we think of ourselves as so empirical. I just find that ironic. But here's what he does. He says, so let's just take all we know. And what he's seeking is certainty. And, and Descartes is known for the Cartesian coordinate system, right? What do you call that? Sort of geometry, but it's, what's that? Analytic geometry, thank you. Where you combine algebra and geometry together. And so very significant, but a mathematical turn of mind. Also, I think he invented the adding machine, or an adding machine. But anyhow, but a very, very mathematical turn of mind. Math was for him the model of certainty. And there's a part of this is, how do we think? How do we reason? Syllogism is at the heart of this. Aristotle identifies these in his Logic, and the classic one is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And there's laws to this. These two are the premises. This is the conclusion. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premise when you have this structure of all A, so you can put this like algebra again, is B. C is A, therefore C is B. Now, there's two things to look at when you're thinking about a syllogism. Truth and validity. Validity has to do with the structure. Is it like this? Now you could say Socrates is a Greek. Well, we know Greeks are human, men, but that's not in the syllogism. So therefore, this doesn't follow, right? So you've got to have the right structure. But you also need to have true premises. So you could say all men are green. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is green. Well, it's valid, structurally valid, but it's incorrect because the premises are false. Okay? Now, this, and when you, one of the things we'll see about this later, syllogisms have no place for time. They are always correct in any time, in any place, in any circumstance. That's the power of them. And there's a tendency in theology to say that doctrine functions like syllogisms. And what we have in Scripture are stories. And these stories need to be translated into doctrine to get to their, you might say, their essential truth. We get closer to the essence of them. Because stories are messy. Narrative, all that. But what narrative has that syllogisms don't is time, temporality, and a place for the will. So in a good story, the question is always what happens next. In a syllogism, that's an irrelevant question. It happens like that. You get the proper structure, there's no place for it. So what we lose is that temporality, that will, you might say freedom. Descartes would say exactly, we want to get rid of freedom because freedom messes it all up. Freedom means you don't know how it's going to come out. I want this conclusion to be necessary. Not free, necessary. So that necessity becomes the hallmark of logic. There isn't a way to say, well, maybe it could be, maybe Socrates is, maybe Socrates is a dog. No, that's irrelevant. Get that out of there. He's a man. He's mortal. That's it. Done. That's all we're talking about here. Other stuff may be true, not relevant. All right. So Descartes says he's seeking certainty. His model for certainty is mathematics. And his big move, the move more than his system, the move that characterizes him as the is his method for reaching certainty is doubt. So he uses doubt to reach certainty. Peculiar, right? But what he's seeking is, he says, I want to apply doubt to every possible statement till I get to one that can't be doubted. This is the one place in your life you actually have use for the term indubitable, which is something that cannot be doubted, not to be doubted. So he's seeking something that resists doubt. So he starts with this, everything we know, and he starts doubting this. He says, well, maybe I'm dreaming. Maybe all the external world is a dream. So this is like, freshman philosophy kind of stuff. What do we do with this? Well, he says, well, then if it can be doubted, we got to get rid of it. He says, I'm not saying that it is a dream. I'm just saying it's possible. Therefore, it can't be what I'm seeking, which is that undoubtable statement. He says, well, what about maybe math? I mean, certainly you can't doubt math. Well, he says, yeah, you can. Maybe there's an evil genie out there who's making us think that 7 plus 5 is 12 when it's actually 14. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but anyway, just let him go. God, he doubts God. And when God's gone, pretty much everything is gone. He says, except one thing. You know what it is? His famous cogito. He says, cogito ergo sum. There's a great line about Descartes walking into a bar and telling the bartender, I think, therefore I am. Bartender says, I think not. Disappears. Anyhow, so I think, therefore I am. He says, even to doubt this turns it upon itself because the act of doubting is thinking. So he says, this is not doubtable. This is certain. So what is certain here? The self. The core, all that's left, and the beginning of everything is the self. The thinking self. So Descartes says, I am a thing that thinks. That's why, the external world is all gone. Oh, and that includes my own body. I did mention that in here. my own body. And so it's clearly a dualistic system, separating body and soul, body and mind, whatever you want to put that. Okay, so that's his bottom. And in that way, he clearly has put humanity and the individual self, more specifically, back at the center of the universe. Because all the rest of it could be fake, maybe not even there. Copernicus never thought about that. So we've got the self back, and then what he does is he starts building back up again. And this is where it gets really interesting, and this is in many ways less interesting. This is the key point. God, I don't mean to star that, but this is the key point here. But he says, okay, the first thing he's going to prove is the existence of God. Very consistently, he uses an ontological argument. He can't use the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas that reason from the things of the world because maybe they're illusory. So he says, I'm going to start from the idea of God, Anselm's ontological argument that God is that than which no greater can be thought. That's the idea. And he says, here I am, this self, just thinking, and I have that idea. And like Anselm, he says, well, if that's the case, if I imagine God not existing, that's not as great as God existing, therefore God must exist. So he gets God back in. We don't need to pursue that any further, but he gets God back in, then he gets sort of math, and then he gets body, world, and pretty soon he's got all we know, but now sort of solidly established through his system, okay? But the key is this self, and then the self is in some ways, through its use of reason, conferring authority, if not existence, on these other things. That move of the individual, the self, the human, conferring authority is at the heart of the Enlightenment. And I would say that is where, I have this, why we would say that the U.S. is a creature of the Enlightenment. So think about the Declaration of Independence. So, well, in the past, in the Middle Ages, I'm sorry, let me add this before I get to that. One of the things here is on the role of authority. And in the Middle Ages, authority was sort of extra nos. It came from outside of us. So you have things like the divine right of kings. Who rules France? Well, I guess Louis, because he was the oldest son of the previous Louis. And God picked him. If God wanted somebody else to be king, he would have had somebody else born. That's it. So the divine right of kings and God's role in this, and then the church's role, it gets all mixed up. But it's an authority that comes from the outside. And that authority has to be recognized as absolute, etc. Well, so let me get the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, in which Jefferson writes that we hold these truths to be self-evident. You know the famous line, all are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, here's the point. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Not from God, not from somebody outside, but from us. We as humans confer authority on our rulers. We give it, and therefore, the next line is, we can take it back. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Okay, but the idea, we confer that authority, it's the social contract, right, from Rousseau and others. But that social contract is all rooted in this move of we confer the authority, the authority doesn't come to us. Back to that temptation of we can remake God to be like us because we're conferring authority. Well, yeah, good enough on that. What happens is this gets extended to texts. And now, theologically, for the Enlightenment, this raises big questions about the authority of God the authority of the Bible and the authority of the church. So the Catholic Church is rarely as exercised when its authority is challenged. And this was clearly a challenge to that. And so it was clearly against the Enlightenment and ends up being against modernism and things modern, sides with the royal house and the French Revolution. And in many ways, it's necessary to resist this. And in many ways, our resistance put us in a box that we're still trying to get out of, and how people see the church as sort of this anti-freedom, anti-liberty. Any movement that's for social progress, we're against it. I mean, democracy was officially condemned by the Catholic Church for a while. So all this stuff about how Catholics are such a gung-ho on democracy, well, that's a recent development. You know, our first instinct was, no, what, we're going to let the people decide? This is that whole Lutheran thing all over again. So there's roots of this in the Reformation as well. Okay, one last thing about the Enlightenment, and I'll give a few summary comments. It ends, you might say it ends, your historians track its end sometimes to, its beginning, to the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648. Now, the 30 Years' War is a post-Reformation. It begins as a religious war, Catholics versus Protestants. Drags on and drags on. It gets to be more about territory and dynastic authority and so on, until at the end, the two competing parties are Cardinal Richelieu in France and the Habsburgs in Austria, both Catholic. So all that weirdness aside, what this bequeathed to people was that religion, and this, we still hear this very much, religion is a source of conflict and violence. Therefore, in order to avoid this conflict and violence, we need to put religion in its place, whatever that is, domesticate it somehow. And so, affair, but don't bring it into the public arena. So the separation of church and state comes out of this. It's got deeper roots, but very much related to this, and this profound experience of these religious wars, where people were killing each other over things like the doctrine of infralapsarianism, which who even knows what that is and why do we care? But, you know, the Huguenots are out there killing Catholics and Catholics killing Huguenots over stuff like this. And then people say, this is ridiculous. And that called into question also all of this authority, you know, because that's in some ways what they were fighting over. So in sum, how are we doing? Yeah. So in sum, the Enlightenment is about moving away from the Middle Ages, and what that meant to them was reason supersedes revelation. Our authority now is reason. That's how we built the world back, not revelation, reason. And we'll decide what revelation we listen to, but reason is how we decide. There's a conviction that reason is neutral and universal. And with that, that reason is autonomous. Reason is a law unto itself. Okay? It's related to the optimism I mentioned, that progress, toleration becomes a major virtue after the 30 Years' War. Let's just tolerate other people's beliefs, and can't we all just get along? Find a way to do that. And democracy should let everybody voice their opinion, and the majority rules. It was clearly a challenge to accepted authority, and that accepted authority was primarily religious, also with kings and so on, but at the heart it was religious because that's what legitimated the king's authority, which meant that this led to an emergence of secular authority, authority that didn't relate itself to God in any clear way, other than sort of political cheerleading maybe, until two things happened related to the French Revolution in 1799. The American Revolution didn't disrupt Europe culturally the way the French Revolution did. We didn't lop off heads and have the guillotine and all that. But so around the time of the Revolution was followed by Napoleon, you know. So I start with Napoleon. So historically, kings have been crowned by bishops, right? Or the Pope, which is a kind of ritualistic authorization of this person's authority, and that authority comes from God and is related to God. Napoleon names himself emperor, and in 1804 puts the crown on his own head, because there is nobody who has the position to crown him. And if they did, he would be ceding some authority to them. Very much an Enlightenment move. Still an emperor, which isn't democracy, but very much an Enlightenment move. Laplace, a scientist, French scientist, has a book on when he puts together the motion of the planets. And he presented it to Napoleon, we know that. Supposedly Napoleon read it, who knows. But Napoleon did have an interview with Laplace, at which he said, maybe because one of his underlings read the book and prompted him, but he said, Monsieur Laplace, I notice in your book there is no place for God. And Laplace says, Emperor, we don't need that hypothesis anymore. So we move in this scientific arena, and partly you could relate that to what we had up here from Isaac Newton, that he created a system that was so good that in the past you needed God to intervene and give the planets a little boost now and then because they seemed to be running out of energy in all the equations. Newton produced equations where we didn't need God to give the planets a boost. We didn't need God. Now, this raises, I think, a very significant theological issue. Well, the issue of authority, we'll be pushing that next time as well. But Laplace's comment that we don't need that hypothesis. There is what's called God of the gaps. An approach to theology and understanding God, let's say this is the universe of all things we can know. It's the universe, okay? Everything. At the beginning of our human history, let's divide this into two things, reason and myth, that explain, and you could say, make this cooler, I suppose, and call this logos and mythos. The two ways of explaining why things happen. Where do babies come from? Why does it rain, etc.? Well, we don't have very good scientific explanations, in the Bronze Age for why this happens. So I have all these stories about the gods. And the chariots move across, and this is how the rain comes, and the sun rises, and the seasons, and they're great stories, right? I mean, they're wonderful, but not very scientific. Well, we keep pushing and exploring. This grows, and of course, as this grows, this shrinks. This is why Socrates is put on trial. He's explaining things too much by logos and not respectful enough of the myths. If you read the Apology, it's clear he never responds to that charge. He changes the topic. But we keep moving, keep moving. We know why it rains. It has to do with atmospheric pressure and temperature and humidity and all this. Pretty soon we got God is just a little last holdout. And maybe it has to do with, every time you draw a line in the sand, you just know it's a bad move because the next generation of scientists is going to figure out how to erase it. Say, life. Got all the rest of this stuff, but you can't explain where life came from. Well, then, of course, that darn Darwin comes along. And now you can go to the Smithsonian. Well, I don't know, maybe they've taken it down since I've been to D.C., but there's this great video with Julia Childs and the primordial soup. Have any of you seen this? Kind of mixing up the primordial soup and these early proteins and amino acids, and then lightning comes in and boom, something happens, and all of a sudden you have one-celled organisms and they evolve, and it's kind of cool. But what it looks like is, and Laplace is actually writing before Darwin, but God is now out. We don't need that hypothesis anymore. This is our history. Read Dawkins, Hitchens, all these people, kind of new atheists, trading on all this. The fundamental mistake is right at the beginning. To allow God to be a hypothesis. Read the Old Testament. This God is not a hypothesis. This is a person. He gets angry. He loves. He makes war. He makes love. He does, in his own way. But he does all kinds of things, right? But it's clearly not some hypothesis. And somehow in our theology, we got tricked into letting God become a hypothesis. And as soon as we do that, this is what's going to happen. Because we present God as if he's an alternative to, the Ptolemaic universe or something. No, that's not God. There may be issues where we take a stand on this. Why God, we know God created, we don't know how. But we take a stand on some of these things. But allowing God to be a hypothesis was the problem. That's the idea of God of the gaps, where theology is such that God's place in the world is those gaps of what we can't explain. Well, we will fill in those gaps, and then that means we've left God with no place. C.S. Lewis has a wonderful little essay, the title of which escapes me right at the moment, but in which he looks at this issue of God as a hypothesis. And I can track it down if you want. But he says, okay, imagine that you're a scientist, you have a hypothesis, and you get countervening evidence. What you ought to do is suspend your belief in the hypothesis until you check this out. Okay, that's being a good scientist. And he said, not all do. Some are too committed to the hypothesis and they don't follow the data, and that's bad science. Now imagine your relation with your wife. You love her, you have a commitment, believe that she loves you, and somebody tells you, I saw your wife going into a jewelry store with Mr. Smith. I think there's a problem. Is the right thing to do to right away suspend your belief in your wife, like a scientist on a hypothesis? Or do you say, I know my wife, I bet there's some other explanation here? He says the way we act with people and our confidence in people is different than the way we react with hypotheses. So too in our relationship to God. So that in our relationship with our friends, or even more our vowed partner like my wife, the right thing to do is not willy-nilly suspend belief all the way. There's a certain persistence in belief until it's kind of kicked out of you. But if you did that with the scientific hypothesis, it'd be bad science. So there's a difference. And that's one of the problems with allowing God to be a hypothesis. It looks like we're failing because we persist in our belief in God contrary to the evidence. That's a whole mistaken way to portray the whole thing. First of all, God's not a hypothesis. We're not contrary to the evidence. We just have a bigger picture in which we're putting all that evidence. So this sense with the Enlightenment is a problem, because this is what they keep pushing this way with God. Maybe a last point and then a couple handouts. Part of what goes with this is this issue of the neutrality of reason. I mean, that's why you can suspend your belief so well, because you're neutral, you're not committed. Otherwise, it's like bias, all those things you need to eliminate bias and so on. This is related to a fundamental distinction made by the Enlightenment and many people since between fact and value. And this will finally, we'll get a connection, we'll loop back to our Christology here. But so fact, and you'll read in Powell, he uses this in the book, puts it in maybe fact and belief. But anyhow, this is reason. It's objective. It's neutral. Scientific. It has to do with things like history, as we'll see. Say more about that next time. So, yeah, okay. With value, we have things like feelings. How do you feel about things? It's subjective. It's biased. It's more poetic and scientific. And, yeah. So instead of history, we could say belief. Those don't oppose as well as the others do, but you'll see in a moment. This is theory. Kind of going back to what we were saying here about narrative, moving to syllogisms. This is theory and this is narrative. These people, on their values, you tell stories and so on. And so that some articles written sort of in the mid-20th century by some of the logical positive folks would say that when you make an ethical claim, what you're really saying is you're not talking about any statement of fact that murder is wrong. You're saying how you feel when some murder happens. Well, it's just rife for relativism, right? It's all just about how I feel. It's not about anything else. Well, So somebody else feels murder is okay, that makes it okay? I mean, what is this actually about? But, it's not, ethics is not objective. So you can see some of the pushes on here. Where this will play out in terms of our reading for next time, this is the Jesus of history. This, the Christ of faith. And one of the enterprises through the quest for the historical Jesus from the start that we'll see is that for some, not all, we have to be very careful not to generalize here, because I don't want to say that the historical enterprise is somehow invalid or bad. That's not it at all. But how it can be used. But to drive a wedge between these two. And I think you can't fully understand that if you don't understand that that is the product of centuries of cultural forces at work. And that's why people are so predisposed to accept this. Because they do in every other arena of their lives. And they accept this distinction somehow. And part of what we need to do is eliminate this distinction. And that is part of what happens in the movement that you hear about is post-modern. And we're not going to say much about that. I'll just give you a couple statements and then we can drop it and wrap up. But it means many things to many people. One of my favorite articles about this, the guy begins by saying, postmodernism is like intellectual Velcro dragged across culture. And it just picks up a few things here and there, and you've got this hodgepodge of stuff. I thought that was just a brilliant image. But so it means many things to many people, and so it's kind of hard to talk about in that regard. But one thing that's clear is that it's a critique of Enlightenment universality and neutrality. So that's something that isn't really here, but we could add universal versus parochial. Not in the sense of parish, but like just local. So universal. Okay. So the postmodern is a critique of the Enlightenment claim to universality and objectivity, or no, neutrality. So the Enlightenment, it's Alistair MacIntyre has a number of books where he pursues this. He's a philosopher, become Catholic, wrote After Virtue. But he has this book on, three rival versions of moral inquiry. And one is kind of Nietzschean postmodern relativism. Another is Thomas. And the third is the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Quite apart from anything else in the book, just to think of that as the framework. But he says, this is the prototypical Enlightenment product. Because it assumed that any educated person could go into any topic or any culture and understand it on our terms. So everything is brought into the terms of kind of sophisticated, academic British life. But that'd be true of continental life as well. And what it gets at is he's pulling out the claim to neutrality, objectivity, that it's scientific, and that it's universal. And he says, maybe that's not the case. It assumes that you can dispense with the story that the culture uses to make sense of its own world and put this in our terms, and nothing is lost in the translation. He says, what if that assumption is wrong? That's the assumption of the Enlightenment. And he says, maybe what we want to say is, well, that's the Enlightenment story. It isn't that you don't have a story, because they're claiming everybody else has a story. We're neutral. And another book he uses the title, some of you may know this, but the name of, what's the capital of Northern Ireland, where all the troubles were? Belfast. Or is it Londonderry? Who gets to decide? So calling it, I mean, the winners always write the history, and they get to claim neutrality, and everybody else has a biased opinion. He says, no, the winner's story is not neutral, it's just one more story. And what we have then, so this, if this is the Enlightenment story, all of this fact-value distinction, it contextualizes it in a bigger picture, which says, calls into question kind of these meta-narratives, but basically says everyone has a story. And that story is chosen very pointedly because it means we have a narrative, we have a context. You can't abstract this into a syllogism. Or if you do, something's lost in the translation. And what's lost may be what's most important for understanding these people or whoever. So everybody has a story, and then that gets played up in various ways. I would say there's two, So I think there's two sources of postmodernism that we can see, and just like there were two sources in a previous generation of existentialism, they turn out to be the same. Nietzsche on the one hand and Kierkegaard on the other. Nietzsche is a kind of godless nihilistic view, where in postmodernism it's all about power. It's all about, because part of this is with the story, stories are related to communities. So that is the context for any knowing. And it gets to be social, et cetera, et cetera. But so then Nietzsche says, well, it's all about which community has the most power, and that community will get to tell the story. And everything else, it's all just relative, and it's all about power. And Kierkegaard says, no, ultimately there are truths, it's about God, but how you see the world may be a function of where you stand. So standing within the Catholic tradition, or you might say, as a Christian, standing at the foot of the cross or at the mouth of the open tomb, our claim is when you stand at the foot of the cross, you see the world truly. Now, you move away from that, you may or may not see that. We're not saying we see everything, and we're not saying that it is whatever we want it to be. No, what you see when you stand here is true. That's the whole point of conversion. You move from one place to another. I mean, another C.S. Lewis essay, a great one, Meditations in a Tool Shed. It's 4 pages. It's just awesome. But he walks into this tool shed, and it's a sunny summer day, a little crack in the roof. And through that crack is that you can see a beam of light. And you know what that's like in the beam of light. You can see dust dancing around and stuff like that. This way you can look at the beam of light and you see one thing. You can move and stand in the beam of light and look with it outside, and you see blue sky and leaves through the crack. There's a difference between looking at this light and looking with it. There's a difference between looking at the Christian tradition and looking with the Christian tradition at the world. The first can be done more academically. The second requires a conversion. You have to move from one place to another. Now, I don't want to suggest that these are exactly the same, but this is not unique to Christianity. Imagine that you're taking an astronomy class, and the instructor said, and you're not very well educated, and you come here and you're all excited about college and taking this class. The instructor says, look through this telescope and you will see the rings of Saturn. Say, no, I want to see them with my naked eye, or I don't believe they're really there. This could be some contraption, there's some video in here. I'm not some sucker that just fell off the turnip truck, No. The only way you're going to see this is to look through this thing. You have to move and do this. We don't think that's brainwashing. We don't think it's manipulation. We don't think it's untrue to the scientific method. It says, if you want to see that, you have to stand here. And in a way, Christianity says, if you want to see the world the way it really is, stand at the foot of the cross or the mouth of the open tomb, and you will see truly. And you can't see it any other way. And in some way, that's our identity. That's the question that we ask and the position. And that has to do with community. It has to do with location. It's not neutral. We're not saying what you see is neutral. We are saying in the postmodern way, in the kind of Kierkegaardian strand of postmodernism, not the Nietzschean one, This isn't just about power. We're not manipulating anything. This is just the fact. There are things you can only see when you stand here. And it's revolutionary if you really look, what you will see. It's transformative. And there's no other way to see it. Well, that doesn't sit so well with the Enlightenment, but it does actually sit with postmodernism. So postmodernism is not an inherently anti-Christian, anti-faith position. There is that strand of postmodernism that's totally nihilistic, all about power and relativism. But that doesn't define the whole movement. So there are ways to critique the Enlightenment that are intellectually responsible and actually open a space for Christianity to be Christian. In a way that in the Enlightenment it's very hard. We have to play on their terms, and that makes it difficult. Now we'll see what that means for history. I want to end at 4. Let me just say that one way to kind of harvest a lot of this is that what I'll elaborate a little bit, about 5 minutes next time, 10 minutes, is history, critical historical method, is about our conferring authority on texts that we used to just take at face value. And this starts, you might say, with ancient texts, historical texts, and moves ultimately to the New Testament and the Gospels. And I used to say, well, this is true because it's in the Gospel of Matthew. And now we say, well, we'll decide whether that's actually what happened or not. That's a real transformation. But it flows out of all of this kind of movement and authority. Okay, a couple handouts. I'll save that one for next time. So only one handout. There you go. I will just give you a clue. On this page, which I'm going to show you, is the key to the intellectual history of the last 200 years. So come next time and get that. So here are some things that are culled from a number of things. Powell has some of these. Some of them come from Funk, the Jesus Seminar, the 5 Gospels reading. But so the first on the criteria of authenticity. We'll work through these next time. But these are criteria by which scholars, both people of faith and not people of faith, attempt to determine whether sayings or deeds of Jesus in the New Testament are authentic. How do we get behind the text to determine that? And then on the flip side is the synoptic hypothesis. This is explained in the 5 Gospels. It's a little more confusing because they bring in the Gospel of Thomas and other things. But essentially, what are we doing? Yeah, I can do this because it'll help with the readings for next time. And many of you probably know this from any New Testament class and so on. But essentially, you could say we have Mark and Matthew and Luke. And there's material in Mark that's copied in Matthew and copied in Luke. But then there's also some material that is common with Luke that's not in Mark. So we figured, well, they probably both had access to some other text, which we call Q. Nobody has Q. It's German for Quelle, which means source. So it's when people think about the Q source, I think it's a source. But anyhow, it's essentially what we think. People have tried to reconstruct it, that it's kind of a sayings source. It doesn't have a lot of deeds. But I would say, don't you think this would be a great gig that you would be a scholar of a text that nobody has? How could they argue with you? Well, it's not in the text. Well, you got the text? Okay. Anyhow, Q's real. It's there. And then there are unique parts of each. Some of their own stories, but then also some where they have added things to what they inherited from Mark. These are very revealing. That's when people talk about redaction criticism. It looks at the editing that Matthew and Luke did to the text they received, and that, more than probably anything else, discloses the character of the community they were writing for. So, for instance, Matthew is always connecting to the Old Testament. Even the structure, some would argue, is 5 books like the Pentateuch and so on. So clearly a Jewish community. Luke often has to explain Jewish things, which shows it's probably a Gentile community, just because of how he edits. And Mark just makes a statement. He says, my people aren't going to know what that is. I have to tell them. You need Messiah, the anointed one, things like that. And then you've got John as a separate source, probably. He's not in this triumvirate. He's on his own, some things in common. But you can see how that gets played out here and the dates of them. But that will go back because there's a kind of preference for earlier sources are more authentic. And multiple, things that have multiple attestation, we'll see as one of them. Well, if it's something that's in Luke and Mark, but Luke just copied it, that's not multiple attestation. That's basically Mark. But if there's something that's in Mark and in John, okay, now we've got 2 people saying this, that makes it more likely that it happened. But we'll say more about that next time. But those are the basic ideas. Okay, comments or questions that you might have. I really talked at you for 3 hours here. You're very patient.
I don't know, this is a good question, but could you try to sum up how all that you said leads to kind of how you finalized, where you said Christianity sees the world, you should see the world from the cross or from the tomb.
Right.
So
how does that, well, part of it is that sense of our knowing is located. Our knowing is a function of where we stand, affects what we see. That's a postmodern claim. Because in the past, even before the Enlightenment, everybody just thought that reason was sort of neutral and universal. And the Enlightenment made that such a powerful principle that the church reacted. So in that sense, that's you might say, a corrective to that force that would say reason is neutral and then faith is biased. Well, if this conversion is like an act of faith, I'm going to come and stand before the cross, that conversion, that relocation, may actually open up experiences and data, if you will, to me that I wouldn't have seen before and can't see any other way. So that's kind of the trend there. In that. Does that make sense? I mean, there's a lot more in the past that doesn't necessarily play into that particular position. So I didn't mean that to summarize everything. So that part of it is, and this isn't related to that, another summative point is this notion of how we confer authority, because that will become the driving force for some of the people in the historical critical approach to Scripture, which goes back to Descartes and conferring authority and that shift in the Enlightenment. It's the shift in the modern consciousness. I mean, I would argue we don't think about things exactly the same way they did in the Middle Ages. And we need to understand what those changes are so we can understand what we have in common and how we differ, because we are in one church with them, despite these big cultural changes that we've gone through. So we need to understand these cultural changes to some extent. I mean, you could have whole courses on this, and we're pretty much done. I'll harvest it next time for history, and then we'll be moving into the particular text. But all those cultural forces are shaping how we think about Scripture and the role of God in our lives. That's us in this class, and it's the people to whom you will be ministering in whatever work you're doing. This is how people think. And we need to understand this somehow. I mean, I don't want to make it too simplistic, but understand what these pressures are, the assumptions they bring about reading the text. Very few people simply take anything at face value. That doesn't mean they're lost to the faith. How do we respond to that appropriately? So one way to respond is just say, no, you just have to be different. You have to be more like they were in the 1200s. That's probably not going to get you too far with too many. There may be some, there are some who would respond to that because they long for that. But others are more in the mindset of the progress, the future, the conferring of authority, the role of reason, the centrality of the human in the universe. And we're trying to figure out, how does God fit into all this? If we don't know how all those things are at work, and I don't want to suggest 1 3-hour lecture does all that, but some sense of how those things are at work, we won't really understand why people don't respond the way we think they will? And then how can we adapt to touch them and reach them and connect with them better? And I think that's one example, and in some ways this has become more global because of Westernization, but part of this is also a case study, and this is part of what the whole course is, a case study in enculturation. Is what we're going to see as we go through the course, and I'll talk about this a few times, but it really is intentional. You know, it's easy to think that enculturation is about how does the gospel relate to other cultures. Well, just that thinking of the other cultures as other cultures, that goes back to everybody else has a story, but we don't. The gospel was enculturated in European culture as well. And this course is about how that happened. And if we understand that and can master some kind of pattern recognition for how the church responded to these various cultures over the history, we may be better equipped to figure out how the church should respond to different cultures that exist in my parish. Because we've seen some patterns. We're not going to make the same judgment, but we might use the same process. So, an example of that. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, even somewhere in the 1st, there was conversation about whether, because New Testament is in Greek, all the things were in Greek, and it came to Rome. Well, the Roman people said, you know, we would like to have the liturgy in our own language. So can we have it in Latin? Now, I have to say, I just take it as an article of faith that at some point there were little 2-year-old kids who ran around the streets speaking Latin. I find that just like one of the most mind-blowing things. Really? This actually was a real language? Anyhow. But so the Latin came into the liturgy because Latin was the vernacular. You can see where this is going. Then you fast forward 1900 years. We have an argument about can we have English, French, Chinese in the liturgy, or does it have to be Latin? Well, the people who argued for the Latin argued for this on the basis of tradition and faithfulness to the tradition, and this is how we've had it, and et cetera. Okay, so here's the question. One, traditionalists understand themselves as being faithful to the result of the process of deliberation about whether they should have Latin. The others, arguing for the vernacular, were traditionalists arguing for the faithfulness to the process by which they came to the conclusion that Latin should be in the liturgy. So who's the real traditionalist? Having the liturgy in the vernacular is not a new innovation. It looks like that, but that's only because we'd forgotten how it was enculturated to begin with, and all we're saying is, let's do that again. Well, sorting that all out is, I think, related to this in terms of where does authority reside, how do we deal with this, what are the limits of inherited authority and new authority, change and difference, and et cetera. So that was the point I was trying to make. It's you might say, painting in really broad strokes, a big map of the culture in which we're trying to answer the question now, who do you say that I am? I would argue I can only answer that as a white, male, European, steeped in the culture of the Enlightenment and teased by the postmodern. I'm not a medieval person. So when I answer it, if what I have to do to be a faithful Catholic is answer as if I lived in the 12th century, I know that's not responsible. How can I learn from the 12th century, learn how they adapted to their time? When Aquinas adopted Aristotle, learn from that and follow the process more than the product. And so that's part of how this all fits together. But we'll be harvesting this as we go. There's a lot here to soak in at one time. I know that. One more.
I'll just get
okay.
When you go back, at one point in time, maybe Plato was the more preferred philosopher.
Yep.
At some point, Aristotle.
Yep.
In some, I don't know if everyone agrees. Preferred.
Yeah, Plato never totally disappeared, but Aristotle became dominant.
Play into that pattern.
Okay, yeah, good. The world didn't all become Cartesians. There were Cartesians. But what I'd say is, you can remember what's on the board. I always envied those people that have those boards that go up and slide, and oh man, that would be fun. But that V that we had, I think where the world has taken Descartes is at that bottom. Cogito ergo sum. Even if they don't go along with that in particular, and people challenge it, et cetera, the notion that what that means is we are at the center, reason is our authority, and through the use of reason, we will confer authority on texts, on governments, on scientific conclusions, etc. Because really, what else do you have? And when you put it that way, it does seem kind of inarguable. What are we going to use to arbitrate on which position is better? Our reason. And who's doing the arbitrating? God isn't in this. We're arbitrating. We're the ones who are deciding what's true and what's false. That part of it, I think, really shaped modern culture. Prior to that, we were far more open to inherited authority. Not anymore. You need to prove yourself, everybody. The Pope, from the Pope to me. And I think that's the big change. And that a lot of that is Descartes formalized that. And what usually happens, these people are like watersheds into which a lot of stuff flows, and then it flows out again. And there's somebody there who didn't originate all this, but takes it all, gives it a different shape, and sends it on. And Descartes was one of those transitional figures in the history of how we think. Yes?
I was just wondering about Kierkegaard. I read a lot of him a long time ago, though.
Oh, good.
But I like him a lot. But,
it's okay, you didn't get extra points for that.
yeah,
So
no.
I just want to be clear.
No, I always really liked him. But,
I have a reputation, so anyhow, go ahead.
can you say some more about the idea of location then? Does he say that it opens then up a window into like a higher view? Or
Okay, how are we doing? I can do this in 2 minutes, and then we'll do more when we get to the text as part of the background for understanding. One of the things that's not at all in the fragments, in what you're going to read, but the things for which Kierkegaard is best known is the stages, Stages on Life's Way is one of his books. He says, and I'll elaborate this later, but just to be real brief on how this connects to the postmodern. He says human life can be totally explained in 3 different ways. And stages, he doesn't mean developmental. There is a kind of developmental, but think of it as like a 3-ring circus, like theater stages, okay? So a stage on which life can be lived out. One is the aesthetic, in which life is ruled by a pleasure-pain calculus. Things are good if they give you pleasure, they're bad if they give you pain. He says we're all born into this. The second stage is the ethical. And here it's lived according to good and bad. But there's an ethics here. Whoops. There's an ethics to the aesthetic, but it's an ethics that's based on pleasure and pain. I'll come back to that. This third stage is the religious. Lived according to the will of God, and a subset of this, or a stage 4, it doesn't really matter, is Christianity, which is lived according to the paradox of the eternal taking being in time, Jesus Christ. Now, his argument is that these, or some like them, are whatever number it is, there's a finite number. So these are the options. And more significantly, because sometimes he combines these into ethical, religious, and so on, but more significantly, each stage can explain all of life. Each can account for all the data of your experience. So there are people, actually I read it, there's a little thing in the paper a year ago about this. There are people who are atheists but just love the aesthetic experience of liturgy. They love incense, the bells, the whistles, the whole thing, and they tend to be Catholic or more often Episcopalian. They just really get into this. But they don't believe anything. So he says, that's it. The aesthetic can bring the religious in. Each one, it can explain everything. So you can't say that there's some anomaly, some experience it can't explain that forces me to become an ethical person. No, at some point you get despair, you realize that pleasure is fleeting. And he writes these great things that Either Or has these wonderful, the rotation method about how you learn to watch how when you irk your professor, he gets a little twitch and his vein twitches and then he sweats and you kind of play this off and one time you get pleasure out of one thing and the next because it gets boring. Pleasure is ultimately elusive. It's momentary. It's gone like that. And that so that in the climax of your experience of pleasure, you realize if you're thoughtful that it's unfulfilling, it's going to end, and you're already looking for the next rather than enjoying what you have. That's the aesthetic life. Well, that may lead you to say, I want something else, or it may lead you back into the aesthetic. And he says, basically, this is like the romantic philosophers of his day. He lived from 1813 to 1855. And he says, so he writes stories about, there's the club, for instance, he calls it, also in Either Or one, but the super necromanoid. People get together, they model it on Plato's Symposium, and they have this great meal, the music in the background, and they drink a lot of wine, and they get up, and they talk about the unhappiest man. I am the unhappiest man. That the people who are proud of their despair aren't going to change, and they stay here even though they know it's ultimately nothing. Okay, that's the idea where you can explain everything. So you have to choose to be different. You have to choose your way out of here. Here he writes Fear and Trembling about Abraham sacrificing Isaac. I don't know, one of the most unsettling pieces I have ever read. And he says, and he doesn't get into all how Abraham knew this, but this comes to Abraham as the word of God, that he should kill his son. Kierkegaard says, ethically, you read that text, there is no way to explain this as an ethically good deed. This is murder. Actually, it's genocide, because in Isaac resides the whole people of Israel, countless as the sands of the sea, and his father is going to kill him out of faithfulness to God. He's doing it because of the will of God, not because it's ethical. He suspends the ethical. But he also says, at the same time, Abraham cannot lose faith in God's promise, which was never abdicated, that his son will be the father of this nation and descendants as numerous as the sands of the sea. How those fit together makes no sense. Abraham doesn't do it, doesn't ask. But at one point he imagines, he says, preliminary expectorations. These 4 scenarios of how this could be. And one is, like Isaac looks up and sees Abraham with the knife and sees this tear going down his cheek. And he says, no, that can't be. He would not be the father of faith because somehow he has lost faith in God's promise. So through all of this, he has to keep that faith. Well, that is, you choose to follow the will of God. You don't just make God the authorization of the ethical law. Now, so the postmodern point in this, which is why I started all this, is that these are 3 different locations, 3 different ways, you might say Ptolemaic and Copernican, 3 different ways to put your life together and account for all the data of your experience. There isn't just one. And, he says, all the while you're deliberating about this, you are in one of these. Chances are here. And the ship is moving. Existence is underway. You are living one way or another. You can't stand in some neutral stage. You can't get out of your life while you're figuring out how you're going to live. There is no neutral stage. That's the point of saying there is a finite number of these, and one of them is not neutral. They each make you think about your life and everything in it differently. And he says, this is the true. This is ultimately the way we should live. But these are legitimate. I don't have some knockdown, drag-out argument, a syllogism, where I can conclude, therefore, you shall be Christian, you shall be a disciple. No. And it's all about discipleship. And he has these great series of discourses he gives on the difference between an admirer and a follower. Jesus does not call admirers. He doesn't want admirers. He wants disciples. He says the problem is professors tend to be admirers. There weren't any professors at the foot of that cross. It's very unnerving stuff. It's kind of like picking up, for me, it's like picking up a red-hot poker. I feel cauterized after I've read this stuff. But anyhow, that would be the connection to the kind of contrast to Nietzsche, who also says knowledge is located, but then it's just all about power. Who has the most power, they get to make the story. He says, no, there is a truth that's beyond us, but we don't have neutral access to it, which is kind of related to that ellipse, too. All right, well, lots to think about. Thank you very much for your patience. We'll engage this more together next time. You'll have some text to work with, too. So I'll begin with connecting this to the history part. You'll see how we harvest this. Some of it's pretty obvious. It's about conferring authority, but I'll just make that a little clearer. Tie it into these quests, and we'll get at these texts. Okay, good. Thank you very much.